There are thousands of new businesses that are popping up every day, and this presentation will be going over business planning, understanding business planning, and their impact, also the importance, and some basic steps that can help you along the way. Business planning is essentially the structure and outline for the goals, strategies, and financial projections for your business or future business. A living document, as is a way of talking about it, is stating that your business plan is not static. It is not stopping when you make your business, but it continues on past that, along with every other kind of financial data, market research, structural changes. Anything along that goal is why it's called a living document, because those things will change over the course of your business, be it positive or negative, and your goal is to update your business plan to help you have a better understanding of your business and the next steps to take. There's a lot of purposes for this, is to attract investors, secure funds, organize strategies and identify risks and opportunities, facilitate informed decision making. I actually want to talk about the diagram on the left, the strategic planning cycle. First, you have your goals. What are you trying to accomplish here? Typically make money. If it's a nonprofit, you have some kind of different goal, like let's say plant trees. Now, the next step is desired outcomes. What you have your goals. What are your desired outcomes? Where do you want to essentially end up? Do you want to end up with more money, end up helping people? It really depends on what your goal is in the end. The strategic planning cycle is not just for businesses, but it can be carried over in a myriad of fields. Next is strategies. How do you get there? What are you going to do to get to that point, the desired outcomes you want? Measures and targets. These are essentially points of frame. These are your stepping stones and your guidelines to help you. Targets help set a purpose and something specific to move to. Measures are very similar, but they are almost like what you're going to do it, and like railings. They keep you going toward the target. Now, the next one is kind of obvious. It's results. You get the results, you think about it, and you're like, well, I didn't quite get to my goal. How do we improve? This is why it's a cycle. You go back to the goals, rewrite them, rewrite your desired outcomes. Realism is important here. You can be optimistic, but you have to be realistically optimistic. You can't be like, I'm going to make $1 million in the first day. That's not realistic. Start off small, start off at a good level, and we'll get more into that later. But you need to start off at a level that makes sense. A level that for your business and what your goal is seems realistic and doable. We'll get into more of that when we're talking about like financial planning and such, but that is for then when we get there. I actually want to talk about the purposes a little bit more, since they seem a little bit vague and a little bit unclear. A lot of them make sense, like attract investors. Your plan is essentially what you'd show someone like, hey, this is what I plan to do. This is how I'm going to do it. Would you be willing to give me money to help do this? Would you be willing to invest in my idea to make it happen? Securing funding is in the same step of that. Attract investors to get money. Investors are people who who essentially put money into your product or your service or your business in return for some kind of cut of the profit or some other profit or assets that they would be desirable to obtain. Typically, investors are people who just give money to a business to help them get off the ground. So next is organize strategy and identify risk opportunities. We're going to definitely talk about more of these in the future. Organizing strategies and identifying risk opportunities. That's typically market research. Market research and financial planning. Those are the two steps that are some of the more important ones to think about when it comes to starting a business. You have the money, and is the market open for you to enter? We'll get into more of that later. Facilitated informed decisions just means, again, market research. You need to be informed about what you're going to do and how to do it correctly. Next, we're moving on to the key components of business planning. Now we're actually getting into the meat of it and starting to understand what we need to do here. First, the executive summary. This is essentially what investors will look at the very beginning. They'll see your mission statement. This mission statement should be a representation of what you think is best, what your business stands for, what your goals are. And this will help investors see the best factors of your business and if it aligns with their values and mission as a whole. Some investors do it because they want to donate money to a good cause. Some do it just for the financial profit. It really depends on the investor, the sector that you're going into, and a lot of other factors. The vision is essentially the outcome of your goal. The mission is essentially your mission statement, and your vision is very similar to that, but it's not quite the same. Value proposition is kind of what it sounds like. It's your proposed value of your business or idea. Your value proposition is essentially what you're going to be talking about in your executive summary when it comes to the value of investing. It's like a convincing statement. So next is the business and description overview. This is basic information about your company, your basic information like what kind of company it is or what it plans to be. Like let's say you want to be an LLC, which is typically a very common one for small business owners. Marketing position. This is where you fall into the market and like what kind of, then maybe you doing solar energy. You would be in the energy sector. Maybe you do retail or clothing. You'd be in the retail sector. A lot of it depends on the market and fields, and we'll get into more of that later. So next is product and pricing. This is what you're offering and essentially the benefits of it. What are you selling and what are you doing? If you're a business, you're maybe selling, let's say you open a restaurant, you're selling food. Your offerings are food, products, your menu, all that. Pricing is also important because it tells them essentially what you plan to get. And if with research and market understanding, you'll understand how those prices relate to other prices and how good of an offer it seems compared to someone else. Let's say, for an example, let's you open a retail store and your retail store sells shoes. So you open up right next to another store that sells shoes. You sell a brand of Nikes for, let's say, $10. The competitor sells it for $15. You somehow got a way that you can sell it cheaper. Your offer is now more beneficial than the other guys because consumers will typically buy the cheaper product. Next is competitive analysis. This is SWOT, we'll get into that later, and market trends. Market trends are essentially understanding the market research. That term's going to be brought up a lot in this because it is really important to start a business. So market trends are essentially how the market is going. Like if you ever track certain kind of like stocks or the index, which is essentially the currency for currency is the trade for currency, or maybe Forex. Sorry, that is the trade for currency. I apologize. Those are essentially the market trends. Market trends are the change in the market based on, honestly, a lot of factors. Economic, global positioning. Like for now, for an example that's relevant at the time of this recording, egg prices. The market trend is at a very bad place for market trends for egg prices because of the bird flu was going around, killing birds, and farmers having to kill birds. Egg supplies are down, which shoots prices way up. Because of this, the market trend is not quite as positive. Like, let's say you owned honestly, wait, I'm getting too far. I'm going too far with this, and it's a little bit off topic. I'm now going to a different kind of discussion. So next we're going to move on to, I apologize again. So next we're going to move on to target market and target the market planning. So target market is what market you plan to enter pretty much. It could be your community. It could be the sector you're trying to go into. I'm going to stick with the restaurant one for a while. That you're trying to go into that kind of market. That is the target market. It helps to understand essentially what about the market you're trying to get into, where, and this actually helps you really well when it comes to market research because it tells you what you need to research specifically. Market planning is in a very similar frame. Team and management is essentially the composition of your team. Financial planning and funding requirements essentially show your estimated financial plans, which should be backed up through research. And funding requirements is how much money you'll need. But when you finish the financial plans, you'll very easily be able to tell how much money you'll need to start the business. So next is the type of business plans and why they fail. There are traditional types of plans. Type 1 would be traditional, detailed, comprehensive, and used for investing and lending funds. These are typically like, I show you a plan, and then I want you to tell me if it's worth investing in. Will you give me money for this plan? It's an idea. These kind of ones are an idea. These are very common. Then you have the lean startups. Shorter, focused on key element, values, proposition, revenue streams. These are, in a sense, could be used both internally, as essentially your business or future business could use these as guidelines, but also used for investors. But typically traditional ones, because investors like to see details, they like to know what they're investing in, not just what, but the person too. If you're doing some mediocre work, you're less likely to get an investor, because if you think about this from your perspective, if someone really lazy was like, can you give me a lot of money? And then someone was really, really active and they did their work, they did their research, they looked good, and they asked, can I get that money instead? You're more likely to give it to the person who looks better. That's just common. Like, that's a commonality in investing. It's something to keep in mind when you do something like this. So next is common failures. These are things that people tend to do that just really mess up a business plan as a whole. One, unrealistic assumptions. You need to be honest with yourself about what you plan to accomplish and what is best. In my personal philosophy, I think it's always best to look at the pessimistic worst case scenario. Don't build to that, but think about it. If you're starting a restaurant company, you should think about the fact that it may fail. So you need to both plan for that and also build around that. What I mean by that is, I don't mean don't put everything into your company if you think it's really worth it. If you want to do that, that is your prerogative. What I'm saying is you need to understand that that is a possibility. Don't be like, I'm going to become the biggest market retail seller. You could do that. You could think that. That's fine. Having a goal and having aspirations is important. But you need to realize there's steps to get there. It's not instantaneous. Things may take time. Small steps. Next is a lack of focus. Sometimes you just don't know what to do. This typically comes with market research. You don't know what to research. Your business itself is not clear what it's going to do. Like, for example, you're going to sell clothes. Okay, cool. That's a good general idea. Now, what are the specifics? Are you going to sell? What kind of brands are you selling? What kinds of material are you going to use? What people are you going to go to as your suppliers? Suppliers is a little bit more complicated, and we're not going to get into that for now. But you need to focus on what exactly you plan to do. A clear plan is very important. Now, next is poor execution. That's pretty self-explanatory. You have the plan, no matter how good. If done poorly, like you do not actually execute it as you intended, then it's not really going to work. And sometimes, even if you do it correctly, some of the other issues, or some that aren't even mentioned, may cause poor execution. That's why businesses fail, a lot of them. But it's important to make your business as best as possible from the start to give a strong foundation and understanding of where you want to go and what you want to do. Next is unforeseen challenges. This is really not someone else's fault. Well, this is someone else's fault, but also everybody's fault, honestly. The unforeseen challenges is things like market changes. Let's say you want to open a store in in a big city, or let's say a small city, and then that small city is hit with a disaster. Now, that's not a realistic idea. Now you're on a setback or something. That's extreme, but stuff happens, and not everything will go the way you plan. Those are less your fault and more is just tough break, honestly. Okay, so I want to focus more on specific examples. Well, not specific, but general ideas of financial plans, good and the bad. So first, let's start with the good. And then we go back to the bad and we go back and forth, just help compare good to bad. First is the key points. So first, revenue growth projections. This is in the financial plan, which we'll get into more soon. But an example of a good financial plan would be saying like your revenue from 500,000 year one to 5 million. Now, again, this is totally an example. Any startup business making this much money is kind of crazy. There are plenty of examples of it, and I can think of some myself, but that's not quite the point. The point is that it's a solid number to work with. Now, you may make, let's say you make 100,000 in your first year. That's good. But let's say you make only 10. If you're not losing money, Well, if you have a solid goal in mind, a solid amount of money that you can make, work around that. If you work around that number, you may decrease costs, do what you can to increase profits. If you get your expenses below the 10,000, you're in a successful place. Next is the bad example. This is a little bit extreme, but like a bad financial plan would be vague language, something that's not specific. Specificity is very important with this kind of stuff, as we previously talked about. Like saying, we hope to make a lot of money, but you don't give any details. Now, you may not say we hope to make a lot of money. That's a little simple. But if you don't give numbers, solid numbers, people will start asking questions like, what do you plan to make? What do you plan to lose? What are your expenses? Next is funding requirements. Solid numbers to help break down what will cost what can be reduced. This is actually really important. So when you start a company, you're probably going to have a couple of expenses. Some may not have as much as others. Unless you need to buy like some land, some equipment, maybe a job. You don't need any of that stuff. But it really depends on what you're going to start. But having a solid breakdown of this stuff will help you understand what can be changed, maybe what can be improved. All of this stuff is very important if you're trying to reduce costs, keep things as efficient and cheap as possible, while also doing everything that's needed. So a good requirement would be like $2 million in funding needed for manufacturing, expansion, sales, and marketing. Now, it's best to elaborate on that. Like, let's say you needed $1 million for manufacturing, the expansion is going to cost 200, sales is going to cost 300, and marketing 500. That's just a random breakdown of numbers, but generally splitting it up to know what each cost is specifically is better. Now, identifying a weakness in the bad plan would be a lack of financial projections. If you don't have financial projections, you're going in completely blind, and you're essentially going to shoot yourself in the foot later on because you don't know how much the cost will be. You may bring a certain amount of money to do it, but you don't know anything. You're just jumping in and hoping you can swim. That's not a good plan. So next you need supporting projections. I didn't put them down here since these are like big lists of stuff, but stuff like cash flow, which is essentially the money you make and the money you lose on a daily basis, or quarterly, depends. There's different kinds. Next is profit and loss forecasts. Very similar aspect, but more specific to profit and loss and breaking that down even more. 5-year break-even analysis. This analysis is break-even as implied, is when you start not losing money and when you start making no money. Making no money is great. Losing money is bad. Gaining money is amazing. If you're not losing any money, then you're at a solid space where you can just continue on forever. If you're losing money, it'll catch up to you eventually. But I'm not going to talk into like the business plans of losing money, but typically it is best to try to stay above or at breaking even. Profits aren't always necessary. Making a cent of profit is better than making nothing. It is better than losing a cent of profit. Well, I guess losing a cent. Now, a bad business example would be to emphasize the importance of specifics and supporting data. If you don't do this stuff, then there's no real way to tell. It's like claim data 1 in an essay. You need to be able to have the claim and the data. Without the data, you're just stating a fact and no one can prove it's wrong or right. Super important. Next, move on to developing a business plan step by step. Now, this isn't completely emphasized. I do have in my paper, it's a lot more detailed, but what I want to talk about here is the research as the first key point. Conduct through market, competitors, and audience analysis. What this is saying is when you research it, you should research the markets that you're going into, as we've talked about. Again, like let's say you're opening a restaurant business. The market would be competitors as something else. Competitors are essentially other places. What are their prices? What are they selling? How well are they doing? Target analysis would be this is harder to research because this is more person to person almost, or a survey kind of thing. But it would be finding interest in your product. Is there interest in it? Would people be willing to go to your restaurant? And then conduct through the market, which is essentially just instead of specific competitors, it's generally how do people feel about restaurants at the moment? Kind of like how when inflation is up, people stop spending as much on luxury goods. They stop buying cars as much, houses, they're saving their money. It's kind of like the Great Depression in a sense. You need to learn when people are spending, when they're buying, and if what you're in, what market you're in, is affected by that, and understanding the general aspect of the current world situation, world economic situation. Next is the executive summary. Summarize the mission, the values, value propositions, and write it last for clarity. So I actually already talked about this, so we can move on. So goals and objectives. So your goals are typically defined. A very good metric of this is the SMART goal. SMART capitalized, it's an acronym. We'll get into more of SMART later because it is actually a pretty big step in this. But essentially what it is each step is essentially verifying the last. Operational strategies, outcome day-to-day process, supply chain, staffing, and milestones. Now, operational strategies are typically done after your business is formed. But these can also be planned before. And this is totally optional. You don't have to have your day-to-day processes because a lot of that comes down to after your business is formed and you know more information. Supply chains is important though. Supply chain and staffing are good. Knowing where you're going to get your supplies and how it's going to be sent to your consumers and customers, no matter what your business is very important. Staffing is also a big thing too. If you need staff, you need to be able to find them or already have them on a way. It's like, hey, if this is going, I'm going to start this business, would you be willing to join me? If they say yes, you got a staff member. You just need to have an idea of how you're going to do this stuff. Because some of these smaller steps can be some of the hardest ones and can really stop a business from taking off in a way that would be profitable for the person. And you want a profitable business. Marketing and sales strategies, we've already gone over this. Customer acquisition tactics, digital campaign, that's more marketing. The digital campaigns and brand positioning, that's, again, that would be something after you start your company. But it's still important to keep in mind and potentially plan for. There's no harm in planning for the future, as long as you're, again, realistic about it. Then the financial planning, again, we'll get into more. But this is the detailed revenue streams, expense breakdowns, profit forecast, funding use. This is essentially what your expenses are, what your income are, taxes, all of that, knowing a general idea. Now, you're not going to know the numbers. You can make guesses on the numbers, but you're not going to know the exact numbers. But realistic guesses help you define a plan. Typically, guesses should be on the lower end of the spectrum. So you're like, instead of I could max make 100,000, but minimum I could make like negative 10,000. Knowing these numbers help you emphasize and understand what's really important for a business. So next is revise and update. This is essentially why it's called a living document, because as you start your business, as you do more research, it'll change. And that's good. That means you're learning and that means your business is progressing. This is mainly the actual part of the financial planning. We get into a little bit more detail, as much as we can on a PowerPoint slide. So next we get into this, which is financial planning, your strategic roadmap. What is financial planning? Financial planning is the comprehensive strategy for managing business's money. This is how you manage your money throughout your business, both inflow and outflow. We'll get into that in a second. Which involves mapping inflow and outflow. Let's talk about that first. Inflow and outflow, essentially inflow is the money that's being brought into your company. This could be through interest or profits, or I guess gross profits. Then you have outflow, which could be taxes and expenses. Ensuring operational growth and resources essentially means ensuring your operation can still happen, your company can still run, and you're still growing your company too. But the most important part is making informed decisions based on financial data. This is really important because financial data is what will lead you to make, again, informed decisions about your business, how to set it up, what kind of expenses you have, what kind of free money you can use to expand, and so on. As I talked about, I'm going to talk about importance in setting clear goals, but if you notice, there's a diagram on the bottom right for SMART, something I said we get into later, and we'll get to this slide after a second. So first I want to talk about the importance. The important key points, or the importance of clear goals, is they help you anticipate challenges and seize opportunities. If you know what is most important, then you know to take advantage of those situations first before anything else. This also helps build investor confidence. If you know what's best, and they agree with you, like, you think it's best to get the land first, and your investors are like, okay, I like the way this guy thinks. They will have confidence in you as a business owner. This will also support long-term growth. If you know what's important, like what's actually important, I'm not saying what you think is important is, because that's not always the case. But if you know what's actually important for a business, then you know what you need to do to have long-term growth, what's needed for your company to grow. Next is goals. You need to define operational and growth objectives. This is essentially talked about many times throughout this PowerPoint, but it's about having goals to strive for, what your company is going to do, essentially a plan and milestones that you want to reach. Next is to use the SMART criteria, which stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Let's into specific first. The S is who, what, where, and when, and why. So this stands for who are you trying to sell it to, pretty much. What are you trying to do? Why are you trying to do it? When are you trying to do it? And why are you trying to do it? These should all specifically be in like your executive summary. These would be the kind of things you put there. What is your business? What is your market? Where are you going to set up your business? Is it online? Is it in person? When are you going to do it? You need to have a time frame, but that's time bound, and we'll get into that in a second. Why are you going to do it? Money? Possibly. Next is M for measured. You cannot improve what you do not measure. If you do not know what your company's bringing in, what it's putting out in accurate numbers, you don't know if you've grown. This is why like data, all these graphs and such that show growth over time are very important, especially for companies. Because if you don't know how it should look and how it does look and what you want it to look like, it's really hard to do anything about it. This is why you need to record data. This is why things like accounting are super important and also important both legally and financially. Next is achievable. We talked about this being realistic. You should be a challenging goal, but you should also have a realistic goal. You can have an unrealistic goal in your head, like eventually, I want to be as big as Amazon. Now that's okay. There's nothing wrong with having big goals. But for the moment, you need achievable goals. Something that you can do to get to that point that you want to reach. Next is relevant. You need to be closely connected to the objective. If you want to sell in a certain place, if you want to do a certain thing for your business, you need to have a clear and objectified goal, but you also need to be very close to that goal. By that I mean, don't talk about stuff that's irrelevant. Don't talk about what's happening if you want to set up your business in Maine. Don't talk about what's happening in Alaska. That's not going to help you specifically. Unless it specifically does, don't talk about it. Keep things relevant and keep things concise. Next is time-bound or timed. This is essentially, you need to hold yourself responsible for a time frame. This is the same thing as homework or any kind of work that you're assigned. If you do not give it a due date, you're probably going to push it back as far as physically possible. You need to give yourself a time and do it. You need to work through that time, not at the very end, because you're gonna really suffer at that point. Businesses are complex; they require work. Understanding that will help you go a long way. Next, I want to talk about financial planning for startups and daily operations. While daily operations is important to plan out, it may be a little bit hard if you do not know exactly the measurements you're working with, so keep that in mind. So a startup. First, you want to identify startup costs: equipment, inventory, license, real estate. Equipment is as explained. Let's say you want to open a lawn mowing business. You need to both have the car, maybe the truck to drive the equipment around to get to places. Then you need the lawnmower. Maybe you want to do other stuff too. You may need a hedge trimmer. Any kind of equipment that you want to do, that's an expense, the startup cost. Maybe you already have it, so it's zero. That's good. That's a good thing. And just like inventory. Let's say you want to sell clothes. You need to buy the clothes. The clothes are your inventory. That's the cost that you're going to have to buy too. Next, licensing. Now this one's not as common because a lot of companies don't actually use licensings, but some do. So if your company does need one, you need to know the cost of that and account for that too. Next is real estate. This is really only common when it comes to in-person, like businesses, but it is also not a bad idea for an office space. A lot of companies have office spaces, which would count as real estate. There's a lot of reasons for having an office space, but this isn't the PowerPoint for that information to be said. Financial planning and forecasting with financial statements like income, balance sheets, and cash flow. Those are the three actually most common kind of financial statements and forecasting that you'll find in any company. Actually, most companies have this as public information. So if you want to ever look at someone else's company, like that's what it should look like, that's how they have it, you can totally do that. It's free information online and it's posted legally by the companies because it's required by them. Next is daily operations. This is regular monitoring and adjustments. What that means is essentially you need to know what's going on a regular basis and adjust for changes. If you don't adjust, then something could happen and you have no way of knowing. You have no way of fixing or understanding. Use of technology. This is important because as the time goes on, more technologies are made, and they're just more efficient ways to do things. That's why things like robots may be taking over factories and factory worker jobs because it's just more efficient for a company. Some companies aren't always about profit, but a lot of them just are. So using software, spreadsheets can really help work in a lot faster and efficient way. Next, I want to talk about the graph on the side. I haven't brought that up yet. These are just some essentially things that you may want to have or should have in your business plan. So the financial statements come to income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement, as previously talked about. I'm going to break this down a little bit more. So in the income statement, you have the key components: revenue, cost of goods and services, that's COGS, it's an expense, operating expenses, and profits. The purpose of this, assuming you know all those terms, is to assess the overall profitability and efficiency of your company, making sure that your revenue is understood, your profits are understood, your costs, and your operating expenses are understood. If you understand each of these factors, it is a lot easier to adjust them. Next is the balance sheet. This is your assets, liabilities, and equity. Now, assets are a weird thing. A lot of people think assets are one thing or another, but just because something is as you think an asset does not mean it is. Assets could be like, let's say you own a car. A car is an asset. But it's also important to realize that if you pay that car, like you have a loan on that, that is a liability. You may own the car, but you're paying on it. If you're not paying money on it, then it's typically considered an asset. But that's a little general and not quite as fully encompassing as what an asset is. When you research a company, you should learn what an asset is and if what you need, like your equipment, is an asset. Equipment and inventory are assets. Just put that out there. So equity, a little bit too complex for this one, but to understand the purpose of a balance sheet is to understand the financial position of your company. What do you own? What are your debts or liabilities? You need to know what your debts are, what your assets are, and what your equity is. Next is cash flow statement. This is more specific when it comes to operating, investing, financial activities. This is more like your operating costs and expenses, but also a lot of companies invest money in other things as a form of income. I mentioned this a while ago, but interest would be from such things. It's just to monitor liquidity, manage cash flow efficiently. Next, we're going to talk about effective budgeting and market research strategies. This is about building financial health and informed market decisions. This is the market research I want to get into. I can't go too far into detail, but I'll go as far as I can. Okay, so first I want to talk about budgeting overviews and importance. What is budgeting? Budgeting is a strategic tool for tracking income and expenses. So why does that matter? Why is it important to track those things? Because it helps control spending, maintain financial viability, and guide decision making. Now, we've talked about a lot of that besides maintain financial viability. We've talked about this, but the specific term may be a little bit foreign. Financial viability means, is your company financially stable? Does it financially make sense to continue being a company? Pretty much, it's about making sure your company is in a profitable or not an extreme negative state. By negative, I mean income-wise. So next is the role in business. The role of budgeting in business is to support both the day-to-day operations and the long-term investments or in growth of a business. Budgeting allows you to both understand your costs, your expenses, but also your income. This will be like, I have $100,000 to spend after all expenses or that's unused, that's very common too. So knowing this stuff will help you a lot. Next, we're going back to the financial situation. This is just to gather financial data, bank statements, receipts, cash flow records. A lot of this is actually necessary legal-wise for taxes, but that's something else, and that's accounting. So next is to set smart budgeting goals. You need to define specific targets using these SMART criteria, as talked about in a previous slide. Examples would be reduce fixed costs by 10% in 6 months. Now, you can only do this if you understand and know what your fixed costs are. This is why something like budgeting and financial statements and planning are very important, because without knowing these costs, it is almost impossible to reduce them by any trackable amount. So next, to identify income sources and categorize expenses. As we've talked about, this is typically things between fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs are things you can't change, things that are essentially consistent every time. Variable costs change, as the name implies. There's what changes throughout the monthly seasons and such. Next is to create and implement your budget plan. This is something I haven't talked about yet, but it is the budget plan essentially projects monthly income, expenses, and prioritizes spending. This is essentially what you plan to spend, because you don't really put this would be part of your financial plan. The budget plan is essentially how you plan to spend your money. So next is to monitor and adjust. As I've talked about a lot, I want to emphasize this point more. You need to monitor and adjust your company, and the budgeting plan is a way to track that. It's just an analysis and a way to track that kind of information, so you can actually adjust it, like compare projections versus actuals. By that I mean, what do you project to happen, what actually happened? And you can adjust based on that. So you have to track this data. Next, I want to talk about the graph on the side. So the data source, like bank statements, would be monthly deposits and withdrawals. The frequency, again, would be monthly. Invoices and receipts. Invoices and receipts really depend on the company. Not everything has it, but some do. So I want to add it here just in case. This would be like sales revenue, expense transactions. Receipts would be like you pay your supplier for the supplies. Invoices would be them paying you. Well, not your suppliers, but your customers, or whoever that may be, paying you. The frequency of this is as occurs. This is when sales are made or things are purchased. This happens in an infrequent rate. It could be trackable, like maybe you buy your supplies every once a week, maybe every month. This is something you want to like jot down to understand yourself. Next is the cash flow records. This is like the daily cash flow and outflow, daily, weekly. It's just to understand what your company's made on a daily basis, weekly basis, yearly, monthly, semi-monthly, semi-yearly. All these kinds of things help understand this in a better fashion. Next is the previous financial reports. These are essentially past analysis, like historical income and expense summaries. These things is not what you would have in a financial plan or business plan at the very start. These are what you'd have after time, but it's here because in budgeting, the previous ones are what you would normally compare against. Have you improved? Have you fallen? Are sales down? These kinds of things are worth tracking. Okay, so now moving to market research and its strategic role. Market research cannot be understated how important it is for a company. Market research is what allows it to actually accomplish pretty much anything. If you understand the market and your customer base, you will do very well if you set up things correctly. So first I want to talk about what is market research. What is it? It is both the gathering and analysis of data on customers, competitors, and the market as a whole. You need to know what consumers are going to want, which are going to be your customers. You're going to need to know if they want your thing, how much they want, how much to supply. See, supply and demand is something you learn from market research. So next you want the types of research. There are two kinds. Market research can be difficult, that is true. So the two kinds are typically primary, which are surveys, interviews, and focus groups. Typically, these are a lot harder to accomplish because focus groups, it's hard to find people who want to sit through. It's also about finding the right people. If you find some random person on the street, they may not have any interest in your product. But how many people do have interest in your product? That's the kind of research that you want. You could do surveys, interviews with people. This would require you to go out and do it or have someone else do it for you. It's not super difficult to find someone to do work that needs to be done. Next is secondary. These are like industry reports, which will help you learn about the market through established sources and government data. These help, but are generally in a very broad sense. But they do give a statistical analysis and understanding of the market generally. So the 6 steps that I thought were good for the process of market research were: 1, define your objectives. What are you trying to find? Typically, this is trying to find out about your business, to build your business plan around, understand the market, your customers, and the competitors that you already established. Next is to identify your target market, demographic, psychographic. So psychographic is a little bit weird. This is how the people feel about it pretty much. Your demographic, you hear about this, you've probably heard about this term before. It's what kind of people are you trying to like buy your product. If you're selling walking canes, I don't think your goal would be to sell to young people, because typically that's not the people who use your product. Finding the people who use your product is your target market. Next is to collect data using multiple methods. This is just when you actually go collect data. The first 2 steps are understanding what you need to collect and doing it. This is actually finding the data, which is the harder step, to be honest. Next is analyzing and interpreting. What did you find, and how can it help you to learn how to plan? Next is to develop insights based on your strategies that you've learned through analysis and interpretation. And finally, it's implementation and monitoring of results. Make sure you monitor your results. Super important, because if you do not monitor your results, you will not know what you succeeded at, what you failed at, or if you're wrong in general. Maybe no one cared. Maybe you just did things incorrectly. You don't know unless you monitor your results. So this is a huge topic, and I'm breaking it down in a very simplistic way. But the final thing I want to talk about is market and consumer acquisition. This is to make informed messages, pricing, positions, and channel selection. This is honestly a very big step. If it seemed underlined here, it's not intentional. But this is a huge step when it comes to market research. You need to make informed, tailored messages. By this, it typically means your target market or target audience, your message should be tailored for them. General messages will not do you as well as targeted messages, because targeted messages will go to the people who you want them to go to and are most likely to buy your product. Next is pricing. Your research should tell you how good or how bad your pricing is comparatively and what you should price yours at. Maybe you want to go below the market rate so people buy your product. Maybe you need to go above. You need to just learn this stuff and base it on what you think is best. There's no one fit. There's no guide to fit all sizes. All businesses are different, but they have common strategies which you need to learn from. Next is positioning. Positioning is a little bit weirder in its term of phrase, but positioning essentially means where you want to go and where you want to essentially start with your business. Channel selection. This is how you plan to actually go about your stuff and your myriad of like tasks for like customer acquisition and marketing. It's how you want to go about it. For example, marketing would be, do you want to have ads online? Maybe you want to have a YouTube ad. Maybe you want a social media ad. Maybe hire an influencer. Maybe you want a billboard. Billboards aren't quite common anymore, or a newspaper, but I don't think you'd find the right audience with that one. But essentially, you need to have a strong emphasis on analysis and market research. Without this, you're just guessing if the people like your product. Now, some products you know, but some you don't. And that's why market research is super emphasized on importance. At the final slide of this PowerPoint presentation about business plans, and I just want to cover some of the main topics that were talked about. So the conclusion that I want you to take away from this is to make a holistic roadmap. And by that I mean a comprehensive guide for aspiring entrepreneurs covering business financial planning, budgeting, and market research. These are the things that you want to have covered in a business plan. You need to have financial plans, budgeting, market research. That is covered in what a dynamic business plan should be. It should be a living guide. By that, we've talked about it's changing. Your business changes over time. Things happen. That's fine. But you need to track those things, securing funds, steering market decisions, and set strategic directions. You need to know where you want to go. You need to know how you're going to do it and how you plan to fund it. Next is financial planning and budgeting. I want to emphasize on forecasting, expense management, cash flow analysis, risk mitigation to ensure operational stability and growth. You need to understand your financial metrics if you want to fully be able to understand how your business will succeed in the future, or you assume it will succeed in the future. It needs to be structured flexibly, help control spending, and adapt to market changes. By this, what I mean is, as talked about, you need to have a financial plan which is not static. You need to have free cash. You need to have something to help mitigate disaster. Next is market research. This will actually back up and allow you to understand the financial plan and budgeting, but this is to make informed positions, how you want to do things, competitive advantage, how you compare to your competitors, and what makes you different and better. Next is targeted acquisition for customers. Super important. You need to have a targeted position that you want to take. You need to know your audience. Integrated strategies for success. You need to combine all these things together into a business strategy and a business plan so that it works for long-term success. So you have a plan for when anything happens, you know what you should do. Thank you for listening for this PowerPoint presentation about business plans, and I hope to help you learn maybe at least one thing.